All right, participants are now being entered into the webinar.
Great. All right, then. I think we'll go ahead and get started. And I wanted to start by welcoming everybody, both the attendees, but most especially the panelists, to Wild Earth webinars. I'm Sarah Macmillan, the Conservation Director for Wild Earth Guardians. I'm just filling in for our Executive Director, John Horning, while he's enjoying some much deserved time away from the office. And we're going to be talking about grizzly bears today. The threats, some success, and some of the advocacy efforts that are currently ongoing. This conversation really comes at a perfect time. Not only will we commemorate the 45th anniversary of the listing of the grizzly bear next week, but we're also celebrating an important win last week in the Ninth Circuit for Greater Yellowstone ecosystem bears. But we're also in a pivotal moment, really, when so much hangs in the balance. We're in the midst of both a climate and an extinction crisis. And it's a time when so many of our laws are kind of, they're laws that provide safety nets for both people and the environment, and they're being pulled out from beneath us. And the bear, in some way, I think, is a beacon for what's possible, both horrible and negative, and positive and powerful. And it can illustrate how our laws and our advocacy efforts should and do protect the vulnerable. So I'm excited to be here, and I want to get the conversation started by asking each of our esteemed guests, Louisa Wilcox, Michelle Dietrich, and Kelly Noakes, to introduce themselves, and maybe to just a short story about how you first got involved in advocacy efforts around grizzly bears. So Louisa, do you want to start us off?
Well, I guess I'm the grizzly geezer among the crowd. I've been at grizzly bear conservation for, I don't know, 40 years or so. And I just fell in love with grizzly bears in the mountains around Yellowstone, and almost collided with one when I was like 17 years old, and just got really curious. I mean, nothing bad happened, but I was like, what was that? They had just been listed, and I just got deeply interested. It became my master's project at graduate school, and then I went on to conservation, where it's always been the center of my passion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Louisa. Michelle.
Hi there. I'm Michelle Dietrich, and I got involved with, well, I've always loved nature, and I'm fascinated by the web of nature. I was in Alaska once and had a subadult male sniffing at my heels. And I turned around when I was backpacking, and it was an amazing experience, and it was a lucky experience because he backed off, and I went on my way. But it's always kind of stuck with me. And when a bear showed up on the Stevensville golf course, just 30 miles north of where I live, I started wondering, well, what do we need to be doing here in the Bitterroot to be ready for bears on the landscape? And so that kind of got me involved and got me to apply to the Grizzly Bear Advisory Council. And I do need to say right away that I am one member of the council, and I speak only for myself at the webinar.
Thank you, Michelle. And Kelly.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Noakes, and I am the Shared Earth Wildlife Attorney for the Western Environmental Law Center. And along with my co-counsel, Matt Bishop, we have been representing guardians in litigation, at first overturning the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's final rule to remove federal Endangered Species Act protections from grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem at the district court level, and then upholding our win at the Ninth Circuit, a decision that, as Sarah mentioned, just came down last week. And I've been working on grizzly bear issues pretty much since the start of my legal career. I was formerly working for Guardians as their carnivore advocate before I transitioned into the litigation side of things here at WELC. And in fact, I recall my very first week on the job at Guardians involved attending a meeting of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee up at Many Glacier Lodge in Glacier National Park. And from then on, it seems a very large chunk of my work ever since has been focused on ensuring the protection and restoration of these beautiful, magnificent species.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And I'll just tell a little short story about how I first really got involved with grizzly bear work. It was the late 90s. It was the month before I went into the basement of the law school to start my legal education. And I spent a month hiking along the Continental Divide Trail from Chief Joseph Pass down to Reynolds Pass just outside Yellowstone. And it was a hike organized by the Alliance for the Wild Rockies. And it was organized by specifically Betsy Gaines Quammen, who now quite recently has become a board member at Guardian. So, you know, things just circle back on themselves. And we spent a month hiking along, really looking for forage, for obstacles, and trying to figure out how this area would serve as a linkage zone for dispersal bears from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which is one of the 6 recovery ecosystems. It still doesn't have any resident bears, but there have been, as Michelle noted, there have been a few sort of exploring into the region. So that's how I first sort of came closer to thinking about bears and kind of looking at landscape, trying to, from the lens of what a grizzly bear needs. So we have a lot to cover, and I want to just really quickly, not for any of you panelists, because you know more than I do, but for people who are attending, because people have different levels of knowledge and expertise, give a really, really short history of the bear up to the date of listing, which is in 1975. And Lindsay, could you put up that first slide? And this slide is from Louisa Wilcox and David Madson's Grizzly Times, which is an incredibly helpful educational website. So I encourage you all to check that out. It's called Grizzly Times. So first of all, you can see in this slide that in the 1800s, there were close to 50,000 bears. 50 years later, there were still quite a few bears. And then 100 years later, all of a sudden, the numbers had dropped to under 1,000, and we've lost 98% of the population and 97% or so of the geographic distribution of bears. So in 100 years, there you'll see basically from 1850 to 1960, we lost most bears and most of the range, and that's good. Lindsay, you can drop that off and get back to us because you guys want to see us, I know. That was 1960 was the last slide there, and that wasn't even the low number for grizzly bears. The numbers dropped even further. Louisa, I didn't know this, Louisa mentioned this recently, but even further after listing in 1975, and I don't know exactly all of the reasons. I bet Louisa could talk to him, but I know one thing was that, oddly enough, even though usually what it means when a bear is listed under the Endangered Species Act is that you can no longer kill, harass, bug a protected species. There was an exception in that listing that allowed grizzly bears to be hunted in northwestern Montana, and that continued until 1991 when a court decision came down that said, no, that's inappropriate. So bears continued to be hunted in Montana, which is my home state, until 1991. So there's a lot more to discuss about the history there, but we have such limited time that I do want to kind of shift into the state of the bear today. And I'm wondering if which one of you would like first to talk about sort of what the scientists say is necessary for recovery of the bear. What do the bears need? Louisa, I saw you jumping in.
I can jump in. Well, I should say that today we only have about maybe 1,800 grizzly bears total in the lower 48 states, and they're divided into 5 populations, all isolated from each other, more or less. but especially problematic is the Yellowstone isolation. And but there is still plenty of habitat between these populations in the northern Rockies and northern Idaho and central Idaho to expand where grizzly bears can be to 9,000, 10,000 bears connected to each other and connected to Canada, which scientists say is what is needed for genetic health in the long term.
Okay, I'm wondering if we could maybe have a quick look, Lindsay, at that next slide. That again, this is a slide from Louisa's and David Madsen's Grizzly Times. That kind of shows the potential for habitat and linkage areas and what's happened between 1975 and 2016. And I'm wondering if one of you, and I'm thinking Michelle, might talk about what's going on in the Bitterroot, why you see that there are bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, Northern Continental Divide.
What?
What's that?
Oh, and the yak, Cabinets, Selkirks, and a handful of bears out in Washington state are very, very imperiled. They're almost extinct.
And that was the recent decision, sadly, not to help that population in the North Cascades. That was just like 2 weeks ago, right? To not augment that population. So
Yeah,
Michelle,
but you can also,
yeah, go ahead.
No.
Go ahead, Louisa.
You can also see on this map in the green, shows the connectivity landscape and also the Bitterroot, how big central Idaho's Selway Bitterroot ecosystem is that could support maybe 700 grizzly bears or so. So the real vision for recovery is connecting all of those ecosystems, but also recovering the bears in the Bitterroot where they're starting to find their way on their own, which is fabulous. And it's a very doable vision. I mean, you hear, oh, this could never happen, but actually grizzly bears are starting to demonstrate with their own paws that it is possible, that they are beginning to they are expanding. And it really does rest on us to be tolerant and to protect the habitat. But this is not a crazy, 10,000 bears is not, some Marxist plot. It's very, very doable. And scientists argue that it's needed.
Yeah. And one of the things I know, Michelle, you're looking at at the Grizzly Bear Task Force, Advisory Council, is how can Montana manage if the bear is delisted, and before then too, but how can Montana manage grizzly bears for their benefit and also to deal with conflict and all of that? And I'm wondering, are there conversations being had about how to make those connections between the greater Yellowstone and Northern Continental Divide and greater Yellowstone and Bitterroot? And so all three of those in particular, wondering if you're having conversations about that.
Yes, connectivity is a big discussion, and how to connect. I mean, if you look at all the little dots in there that are recognized, bears have been in those spots. They're moving and they're getting close and they're getting into the Bitterroot. And so this connectivity can happen, but the problem is where all those dots are, there's also people, ranches, developments, subdivisions, and chickens and dog food and calves, and all kinds of temptations for bears to get into trouble. And when they get into trouble, it's a problem, and oftentimes they are put down. So the conversation is about how do we create a landscape in between the ecosystems that can house both bears and people. And the big issue that, even though we're 18 very different people with different ideas, the big issue that we all agree on is funding and education are so important. We need enough funding to allow people to have the resources that they need and the knowledge that they need to take care of their attractants, the things that bring the bears in, and keep the bears from getting into trouble. So it's a two-way street in so many ways. And so the conversation is a lot about that. Like, what do we do? How do we create this? And certainly funding is a big necessity. And it's a big challenge with lots of different ideas.
Yeah, it makes me think about some of the meetings, Kelly, that you have attended at the IGBC, and I know a lot of the conversations there are about conflict and how to prevent and then manage conflict. And I'm wondering if you have any insight on how the IGBC has been, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Council has been looking at those issues.
Yeah, it's been a little while since I've been to an IGBC meeting, but at the same time, that's a key threat and a key management implication that we need to figure out. And I think ultimately, it's coming down to the fact that, bears will never really be truly recovered if we only allow them to exist and to be restored in these small, isolated populations, primarily within the protected boundaries of our national parks that serve as proverbial zoos. We do need to figure out a way to coexist, and we can if we have that attitude and that perspective that we're willing to understand the essential role that these bears play in our own environment and in the ecological importance of the species, and be willing to make some sacrifices on our own human levels to make sure that we give ourselves the space to coexist.
And I don't know who would like to talk about this. I'm hoping somebody, oh, Michelle, did you have something you wanted to say?
I just wanted to add that another big threat to the grizzly bear is the transportation corridors. So many bears are hit on the highways, and that also creating wildlife crossings is a really important way to allow that connectivity to happen. I just wanted to make sure that was in there as well, because it's a big issue. And 85% of all mortalities are human caused for many different reasons, but hitting by trains, getting hit by cars, altercations with hunters, there's a number of different reasons that grizzly bears are having a hard time on that landscape in between the ecosystems.
I think that's a couple things. I'm wondering, we could list off just all of the threats that are involved. We talked about, you talked about the transportation corridors, highways, trains, interactions with hunters, whether that's there's sort of three different ways that interaction with hunters that I'm thinking about, at least, that causes problems. One of them is hunters go out and then there are gut piles, bears get attracted to that, or a carcass, and then the hunters come back and then there's altercation, there's surprise. So I take it back, 4 different ways. Another one is supposed mistaken identity during black bear hunting season. And then the final is poachers. So there are a lot of ways that humans who are hunting have negative interactions, negative for the bear in particular, usually, but sometimes for the humans too. But then there are other, so let's dig into the sort of the coexistence and conflict too a little bit. Go ahead, Louisa.
Well, I was going to say that when grizzly bears first got listed, the biggest problem, well, aside from continued hunting in the Northern Continental Divide, which was crazy and only was stopped by litigation in 1991, the biggest problem was garbage. Many people will remember the pictures in Yellowstone and the pictures of, feeding bears around dumps, and all of that stopped suddenly. And yet food conditioning of bears continued. And so for many years, up until the last decade or so, garbage and human foods were the leading cause of mortality. That has changed. And a lot of the reason it's changed is due to climate change. Both and particularly you can see it in the NCDE, Northern Continental Divide, and Yellowstone, where the leading cause of mortality now is hunter-related and livestock-related conflicts, because grizzlies have lost some of the key foods. Yellowstone cutthroat trout was one of the 4 key foods, and it's gone due to invasive fish, climate change, and also whitebark pine, a very key food in Yellowstone, is pretty much gone in a very short order due to climate change. And so grizzly bears are having to hustle to get the calories they need to make it, for 5 months in the winter. And so their cows are a great source of calories. So are elk, that a hunter's recently shot. And so they're very, getting really serious about dialing into those foods. And similarly, up in Glacier, climate has driven massive wildfires, even though eventually huckleberry will come back in the short term. Grizzly bears are having to forage way outside, Glacier Park along the east front of the mountain range to find food. And so we're seeing, many more livestock, Michelle mentioned chickens, many more conflicts with livestock than we did before in hunters. So the kinds of mortalities are changing because of our impact on the planet.
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about, there's only so much we can do about some of that at this point, unfortunately, but there's a lot we can do about another piece of that, which is sort of the livestock and the human food sources. There are actions that we can and should take. And I think about the Blackfoot Challenge and how they have been actually pretty effective at finding solutions to preventing both livestock mortality and grizzly bear mortality. And I'm curious about the effective methods that exist out there for conflict prevention, non-lethal.
Well, yeah, so I don't mean to take up too much of this, but the Blackfoot Challenge near Glacier Park is a great example, but hardly the only example of a group of ranchers really solving a lot of their conflict with grizzly bears. Grizzly bears were starting to recolonize the Blackfoot Valley, and the ranchers did some very simple things: electric fencing around calving areas, a phone tree so that if a grizzly bear showed up in somebody's backyard,
shoot.
And also removing dead livestock, relocating dead livestock, which aren't attracted to grizzlies, and taking it to a facility that was a composting facility with electric powered fence around it so grizzly bears couldn't get in there. And it's been fabulously successful. It's reduced conflicts with grizzly bears by over 80%. There are many individual ranchers who are doing incredible things in Canada and the U.S. similarly. So it's not difficult to look at a problem and understand why a bear might be getting into trouble and backing off and figuring out a system. And we have many more tools than we did 25 years ago. I mean, there's bear pepper spray, electric fence, livestock guardian dogs, originally from Europe, are being increasingly used in the U.S. And so, we have many more tools. It really gets to our heart, though, and our willingness to use those tools, and also a governmental commitment to make those tools more available and to make some of the experts who are at the state and federal levels, to create more funding for more of them to be able to help, ranchers and hunters and other, communities.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. There's funding out there to get rid of the grizzly bears when there is conflict. Why in the world aren't we putting that funding up front to prevent the conflict? And I was in a meeting in Cody, the IGBC meeting in Cody, and it was all about conflict prevention. And I sat with a number of livestock producers, and they said the number one thing that prevents conflict is human presence. So I understand people put a lot of cows out ways away, but maybe they can't do that where their grizzly bears are, right? Where the grizzly bears are. So they need to have human beings there. Another thing they said was obviously electric fencing. And then the third was this one fellow, and now I can't remember the kind of dog it was, but it was one particular dog that he said he has had absolutely no conflict since he started getting these dogs. And he said they have a special
he was using Airedales.
He was using Airedales, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. And he was like, they have a special bark. So then I know there's a bear around, and they stand their ground, and he has had no conflict since he started training and using Airedale. So there are really effective methods that will prevent conflict. And then that means protect the bear from mortality, because our mindset still does tend to be, we belong here, and if you're causing problems, you don't, meaning you, the grizzly bears. But Michelle, yes.
You mentioned human presence. I did want to talk about the range rider programs that are creating human presence in the cattle ranches and with the cattle, which is kind of going back to a more traditional way to run cattle and to ranch. It's a great program, and that too needs to be mentioned as far as conflict prevention.
Yeah, good point. So I'm trying to keep us on our timeline to get through everything, but I also don't want to, let's keep coming back to what we're talking about here. But we did want to take a moment to celebrate and talk about the decision last week and what that means. And I'm hoping, Kelly, that you'd be willing to tell us what the Ninth Circuit decided last week.
Yeah, sure, of course. So last week, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the district court's ruling that grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem still warrant the necessary protections afforded by the Endangered Species Act. A species
Yay.
only, yes, yay! A species really can only be removed from the federal list of endangered and threatened species if the best available science clearly demonstrates that the threats causing the species to be listed in the first place have been adequately alleviated. And here, the court agreed with our arguments that the best available science shows that grizzlies in the Yellowstone region are still facing a dire threat to, in particular, their long-term genetic health, because they are a relatively small, isolated population that has not yet achieved the natural connectivity with neighboring populations. The connectivity aspect, we touched on this already briefly, but it's so essential to ensuring the long-term genetic health of the species overall. The service in this case really attempted to manipulate its interpretation of the science to support a finding for recovery. So for example, they relied on the short-term genetic health of the population only. And the court rightfully faulted the service for such short-sighted reasoning. The best available science shows that grizzly bears need to connect to their brethren to the north and the west in order to achieve true recovery of the species overall. And, in short, the service can't shortcut the recovery process by drawing a circle around an arguably healthy population and claiming, the recovery success story without considering the health of the species as a whole. And importantly, delisting decisions must be based in science. I've already said that, but not politics. And in the Ninth Circuit decision, the court also affirmed the lower court's ruling that the service's omission of a pretty vital recalibration provision, which is the method for counting the bears, from the conservation strategy was a pretty fatal error. That decision was not based on science, and instead it was an effort to reach a deal with the states, pretty much. And so thankfully, the court saw right through this pretty critical defect, which could have had pretty disastrous implications for the number of bears that would have been allowed to have been shot by hunters in the end if we were unsuccessful with the delisting challenge. And so the court also upheld the lower court's finding that the service failed to properly consider the impact of delisting just the Yellowstone population on the fate of the grizzly bear recovery on the population overall. And so, really, this is a pretty huge win for one of our nation's most wild beings. And it's a big victory because we can now rest assured that the grizzly bears, at least in the Yellowstone region, will not be subjected to a state-regulated trophy hunt this fall, nor in the foreseeable future at this point. So it's a pretty big win and something to celebrate for sure, that these bears are still worthy of federal protections and need those federal protections in place until we really truly do recover the species throughout their historic range.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And I think that's an important point that you just made, which is that I'm trying to figure out how to say this, but we don't just want the grizzly bear to be protected by the ESA. We want the grizzly bear to be protected by the ESA until they don't need it anymore, and they do need it still. So it's a win because they still need these protections and they're in place. So our desire ultimately, I think I can speak for all of us, is not just that the bear be protected, but that the bear not need those protections. Not that also any of us wants a trophy hunt to happen, but go ahead.
And just to reinforce something that Kelly was just saying, so Yellowstone has like 730 some grizzly bears now. That is not enough. That is too isolated, genetically unhealthy. And to get to this larger vision of 9,000 or so grizzly bears, there's not room in Yellowstone. You have to reconnect these populations. So that is really the solution that we're asking for.
Yeah, yeah. So we have a few questions that have come in, and I want to give us a couple minutes. We don't have a lot of time in the middle, but we'll take a couple minutes in the middle here to try to answer a couple questions. And I just want to say that this win, I think it's clear, but it doesn't mean like we're done with advocating for grizzly bears. There are some powerful forces, trophy hunters like the Safari Club International and the NRA, and then livestock producers that don't want the grizzly bear to have these protections because either they want to hunt them or it's inconvenient for livestock producers. So our efforts are going to go on, and we're going to talk about that after we take just a couple minutes here to answer some questions. Let's see. So here's one from Claudia Narcisco asking, what is the impact of the GYE ruling on distinct population segment policy in general? I'm wondering, Kelly, if you can.
Well, this was definitely a big win in that sense. So the service has all along been trying to piecemeal delist the species. And so drawing that circle around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem by designating it as a distinct population segment under the ESA. And the court really upheld the fact that they can't just isolate this one population and claim the recovery success without considering the impact on the species overall. So the service does have to go back to the drawing board and truly consider what would be the impact if we delisted the Yellowstone population as a DPS. They have to consider, if there's a hunting season right away, is that still going to allow for the connectivity that's necessary to achieve recovery in the Bitterroots and the Selkirks, the Cabinet Yaks, the NCDE? They really have to consider what is the impact of removing these federal protections from this one population. And so it's pretty good precedent moving forward as far as they upheld the DC Circuit Court's opinion back in the gray wolf context, which we don't have to get into in the wonky weeds here, but it's a good decision that, in short, they need to consider the impact of delisting on the remnant of the species, on the rest of the species. They can't just silo off one somewhat healthy population on its own.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Kelly. Thank you. And there's another question about, somebody's asking about if there's any hope for grizzly bears in the North Cascades. And I think the number is somewhere like 10 maybe, or fewer than 10 right there right now. And I'll say that at this point, it's probably primarily political. There was an effort, it was put on hold, it was started up again, and then it was denied. They decided to shut it down. But I'm wondering, Louisa, if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, there's been just a handful of grizzlies in North Cascades on the U.S. side, and similarly few on the British Columbia side. They have not, over decades, been able to get to any kind of substantial numbers. So the only way that there will be hope is to import some grizzly bears there, as has been done in the Cabinet Yaak in Northwest Montana, that otherwise probably would have, gone extinct. There have been 80% of the public that commented on the draft proposal to restore grizzly bears from the North Cascades supported it. And yet political opposition by, ranchers and some people in the communities and their access to high folks in the Trump administration basically blocked it. But the groups that are involved in this are not giving up. They have support, they are dedicated. There is lots of really good habitat. They could have 600 grizzly bears, which is a lot. So we could do better, centered around the national park, but also including a lot of wilderness areas. And the Park Service is really dedicated to this. So, it's not over. Local folks are not going away.
And we'll see what happens in the next administration.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and just to jump on with that, just for context and background, the service did initiate a formal National Environmental Policy Act process for this translocation. So they were taking affirmative steps to go through with this. And then just last week or within 2 weeks ago, Secretary Bernhardt decided to do a totally about-face flip-flop and just basically said that we're all of a sudden going to abandon this altogether. And I think it's a real travesty because the North Cascades are definitely an ideally remote and wild area of the country where they would be perfect for grizzly bears to once again have the opportunity to call home. So I just know from my legal background, we're definitely tracking this flip-flop pretty closely, and we'll be assessing, whether there's potential legal recourse to pursue over the coming months if that's where we need to go. So we're definitely not giving up on the North Cascades like the Department of the Interior has announced that they are.
Yeah. Thank you all. And we'll get back to more questions at the end. We'll have another section, 10 minutes or so, probably a little bit less, but for questions. And I also know Kelly has to jump off early. So I wanted to move back into some of our discussion about advocacy efforts. And I wanted to ask first, Michelle, can you just, and you sort of brought them up, but what would you say are the primary issues that are being discussed at the Advisory Council right now?
We have 5 different sections of recommendations that we've been discussing, and they're education and outreach, trying to teach people that grizzly bears are coming and what you can do to take care of that and make sure that they don't get into trouble in your yard. Conflict prevention and conflict response protocols. And I just want to say that there are a lot of ranchers on the landscape living with grizzlies and doing a great job of it, and they really need support, and they really need more access to resources and conflict prevention. I think we also are talking about, or one section of our discussion is distribution and connectivity. Like, where are the bears? Where are the places they can connect? How can we make it safe for both people and bears on that landscape in between, where they're running the gauntlet? They've got cars, trains, and a number of other attractants that they need to get through before they can get to that other remote habitat. We're also talking about resources, which is a huge deal. We definitely need funding to support the people that are living with bears on the landscape. And then the role of hunting is also part of our discussion.
Great, thank you for that. And that's a lot. And you all have been meeting for months and months and are coming towards, the purpose is to provide recommendations to the governor and the agency, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And you're coming to, what's your timeline about coming to finalizing those recommendations?
We have a final meeting in Helena on the 21st and 22nd, where we will be talking about this month, where we will be talking about kind of the final draft and looking at issues and discussing kind of the final thoughts. The idea is to have public comment until the August 4th, and then a little time to kind of make our final tweaks, and hopefully the end of the month having a document to give to the governor.
Okay, thank you. And we actually will have an action that we put up in the chat box at the end for people to sign on to a comment letter that we'll be submitting to the Advisory Council as well. Let's see, so I'm just thinking about some more about that connectivity issue. And Kelly, I'm wondering, can you tell us about the Flathead Forest Plan? I know you were involved in the planning stage and now we're in litigation. And you talk about why the Flathead is important and what kinds of issues there are in the plan, especially related to grizzly bears. There are a lot of issues I know, but especially related to grizzly bears.
Sure, of course. So we're currently representing guardians of litigation challenging the Forest Service's revision of the Flathead National Forest Plan. And so this plan will be put in place for the next 15 years, pretty much outlining the future management implications for the forest overall. And a key flaw with this plan is that it really decreases essential habitat protections for grizzly bears by allowing increased levels of road density that will really hamper the species' recovery on the forest and thereby trickle down to hurting the species' chances for recovery elsewhere. Since the grizzlies and the flathead, this is the heart of the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, they're a hugely important source population for this species overall. And it really comes down to the Forest Service is really trying to fall back and rely on the fact that they think that the grizzly population was allegedly really healthy and doing well enough back in 2011. And so they're basically just simply dropping the best available science on what is the proper amount of road density and secure core habitat that grizzly bears actually need to recover. They're totally falling back on that and reverting back in time to this like one baseline date of 2011 because they said, well, our population was growing when we didn't achieve what the best available science said back then. So we're doing okay. And I mean, the big part of this is that that best available science shows that the forest really needs to cut back the amount of roads that it has by at least about 500 miles. And they just don't want to do that, of course. They don't want to decommission these roads. And that's what's necessary to provide the essential secure habitat for grizzly bears, though. And so we are going to challenge the fact that the forest is really trying to skirt the science with this arbitrary baseline. And, you know, another key thing that we're challenging for Guardians on the Flathead is their over snow motorized designations. And they're trying to get around some of the travel management rule and the winter motorized recreation aspects. And I'm working really closely with Guardians attorney Marla Fox on those issues. And I've actually, that's one of my big projects this week we're filing our opening brief in early August on August 5th. So that'll all be coming to fruition in the coming weeks as far as really hammering down what are the key important flaws that we really want to attack the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service on with this plan, because the Flathead is a hugely important region for grizzly bear recovery, especially its central location amongst all the other grizzly bear populations and where we hope to restore bears eventually into the future. So,
yeah. And I'm just thinking about something Michelle said, which is the vast majority of bear mortality is human caused. And one of the problems with road densities is both that cars get in there and collisions can occur, but that people get in so that more people interact and conflict. There's conflict with bears, and that's how bears die. So reducing road densities makes the habitat more secure and keeps, you know, it prevents more conflict, reduces conflict, I guess is the word, but yeah. Thank you. And thank you for the work, of course, also. I'd love to hear, Louisa, about the Grizzly Bear Treaty, if you could talk about that. And I know, Kelly, you were involved as well, but I think, Louisa, you've been really instrumental in bringing some of the tribal folks together and helping to organize that. So can you talk about the Grizzly Treaty?
Yeah, I mean, I should say that up until about 6 years ago, the tribal voice in grizzly bear conservation was very, very little, even though, except for on the Salish Kootenai Reservation near Glacier, as well as the Blackfeet, but in Yellowstone, not so much. And I got a call out of the blue one day from a Northern Cheyenne fellow, and also with some Sioux. And if you recall, they did a pretty good job with Custer, and so they're pretty ferocious warriors when they decide to get involved. And they, grizzly bears for tribes across North America have long been seen as relatives, healers, mentors. And in fact, they're so sacred that many tribes don't even mention their name. The word grizzly bear, they're not even allowed to speak it. So
This is what happens when you live out of town in Montana. Sometimes the internet connection is a little spotty, and it's looking like we got some spottiness here with Louisa. I'll just say that I know that Louisa was instrumental in helping to elevate some of those tribal voices. And I don't know if Kelly, you can sort of pick up and talk a little more about how the Grizzly Treaty. Oh, wait, you're back. We keep losing you, Louisa.
You're muted. You're muted, Louisa.
Yeah, I can fix that.
All right. So I don't know where did I lose you? At the beginning?
No, not at the beginning.
Okay.
We were, yeah, I'd say it's like, so you heard from some people, their voices had not been represented. What started happening next?
There was a treaty that the Northern Cheyenne put together with the Blackfeet, and it was eventually signed by about 270 tribes, which is unheard of. I mean, tribes in Canada, tribes across the country, and there was a signing ceremony. I believe, Kelly, you were there, and down in Jackson, and the Hopi and Navajo were there. I mean, it was crazy. The number of tribes basically saying, we are all brothers in this. The bear is our brother. We are not going to have, our brother's head up on a wall, from some trophy hunter if we can help it. And they provided a really important voice. They shocked Fish and Wildlife Service. And eventually, after the treaty was signed, they went to Congressman Raul Grijalva from Arizona to put a bill together reflecting the terms of the treaty that would basically ban trophy hunting. Give them a seat at the table, which they didn't have before, and also provide on the reservations that have good grizzly bear habitat, and there are a lot of them, would provide for a program for recovery of grizzlies on these reservations, which would be huge. And when you look at the prospects for connectivity, and you look at where some of these reservations and treaty rights are, it would really boost the prospects for connectivity and recovery of grizzly bears. So that bill's been introduced several times, not in the Senate, but in the House, and it's a really important addition to the debate.
Yeah, it is really important, and so important to figure out how to just help elevate the tribal perspective and their voices and help them engage here. And
the Salish Kootenai are doing remarkably great work west of Glacier on the road, overpasses and underpasses. Michelle mentioned that, but they need a lot of more, support and resources essentially for coexistence. I mean, it's expensive, bear-proof dumpsters, the whole 9 yards, and so the tribes, really need a lot of help, but they're very game and they really believe in the grizzly bear. Yeah.
Kelly, did you have anything to add to that? If not, I was going to ask to shift into legal advocacy because I know you have like 3 minutes left.
I do have to jump off because I have a virtual hearing starting at 1 o'clock. So I am going to have to jump off, but I will just mention a few other things that WELC is working on behalf of Guardians. We have plenty of attorneys here that are interested in grizzly bears. And so our WELC attorneys, Pete Frost and Shiloh Hernandez, are also working on litigation on behalf of Guardians to protect grizzly bears in Montana and Idaho in particular. And Pete's lawsuit is a really interesting one, and he's really seeking to put an end to the awful practice of baiting by black bear hunters, which is a key threat to grizzly bears because they're often mistaken as black bears and then shot accidentally by hunters when they come across these bait traps. I mean, piles of donuts and food, of course that's going to draw bears in. We have, food orders in place where you have food storage orders across most national forests, but there's an exemption for these awful bait traps. And so Pete's lawsuit is really trying to get at the heart of that. And then WELC is also working on one of the key issues that Michelle has brought up as far as the transportation corridors as well. We recently sent a notice of intent to sue letter to Burlington Northern and Santa Fe Railroad for the railroad's trains being responsible for killing numerous bears up in Montana in particular as well. So there's definitely plenty of work that we're doing here at WELC on behalf of grizzly bears, and we'll keep it up. And I do have to jump off, so I did just want to say thank you. It was really an honor to be a panelist amongst these wonderful female leaders in grizzly bear recovery. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you so much. Yeah, good luck with the hearing. Unfortunately we are kind of running time. It happens so quickly, doesn't it? I wanted to mention also that there's a lawsuit that's just getting going in the Upper Green in Wyoming on grazing allotments there that were recently reauthorized and allowed up to 70 grizzly bears to be killed in 10 years on those allotments. And that's because there's an incredibly long history of conflict there. It's just livestock doesn't belong there. The grizzly bears do. and the Western Watersheds Project, Sierra Club, and the Center for Biological Diversity are challenging those grazing allotments and the allowed take of up to 70 grizzly bears. And I'll just say that a lot of these lawsuits are in their infancy, and they'll take, as litigation does, will take years to wrap up. And we'll continue to keep a vigilant eye on agency activity and look for more ways to protect grizzly bears. And I just wanted to transition now to questions from folks. And Lindsay B., I have to say, I am struggling a little bit right now with my internet, and I currently can't find.
I gotcha. I can.
Okay.
Yeah, I can throw out the questions, and I'll go back to some of the ones that were asked early on. One of the first was from Peter. He said, is there any dire need to continue hunting black bears? And if that were stopped, then that would be one less source of conflict. Someone want to take that one?
Yes.
Well, there's no need to hunt black bears, really. I mean, honestly, people don't eat them. It's really for sport. I mean, for the most part, people don't eat them. It's really for sport. And in places where there are grizzly bears, it makes no sense, because there are so many examples where hunters are shooting in bad light, or they can't identify a grizzly bear. And every year we lose a grizzly bear due to quote unquote mistaken identity from a black bear hunter. So the answer is, it wouldn't be that big a deal to just stop black bear hunting, at least in grizzly bear habitat. Period.
Yeah, and we did recently submit comments on the, was it the Swan River National Wildlife Refuge, where they were proposing restarting black bear hunts, and that's a problematic area. So we said, no, don't do it there, at least. That doesn't make any sense. So yeah, and unfortunately people can allege that they made a mistake and they didn't know what they were shooting. I don't think it's valid. I think you should know what you're shooting before you pull the trigger. But that does happen.
So Mark asked, he just wanted to clarify, is it the Airedale Terrier that was being used by the rancher?
Yes,
it was, but honestly, most of the livestock guardian dogs that really work are from Eastern Europe, the Marima, the Pyrenees that many of you may know, that are a really hefty, beefy dog, and many ranchers are picking up on that now.
Yeah.
Clinton asked, he said the Custer Gallatin National Forest came out with their revised final plan. Have any of you had the time to review it in relation to grizzly bears? They're now in their objection period.
I've read enough of it to know that it is really terrible when it comes to protection of the remaining wildlands of the northern part of Greater Yellowstone on the Custer Gallatin, and particularly the Gallatin Range, which is full of grizzly bears. And the Forest Service didn't even go as far as recommending for wilderness all of an area called the Highlight Porcupine Buffalo Horn. So it is woefully inadequate for grizzly bears, but also everything else. I mean, many other wildlife species and the interest of backpackers and the like.
Peter asked, how can hikers protect themselves from damaging encounters?
I can take that one. I think making noise. There are not many documented cases of attacks of groups of more than 4 or 5. So more people, not going by yourself, making noise, carrying bear spray, and knowing how to use it is really important. And definitely being careful in places where you're going around blind corners and they're not going to be able to see you when you're coming onto them, and also moving slowly.
Yeah, I wanted to echo the bear spray point, which is really important. Folks have tried, we were involved in a couple different petitions to the states of Wyoming and Montana, asking the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks folks who regulate hunting to require hunters to carry bear spray, because otherwise they're automatic, they pull out a gun and shoot the bear. they can use bear spray very effectively and reduce the number, if not get rid of the conflicts that end up with bear mortality. So bear spray.
Right, and one other rule to, sorry.
Go ahead.
One other rule to follow is to be wary at dawn, dusk, and in the dark, because that's when the grizzly bears are out. So that's when you need to be the most vigilant, but always making noise and always having that bear spray handy and ready to go.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. So Barbara asked if any of you know the history of how and when killing bears after a conflict became the policy or kind of the standard, and who made that decision.
The question, read the question again, after a conflict?
Yeah, how and when it became standard to kill bears after a conflict.
I would say since time immemorial. I mean, that has been the way. You know, that is why that attitude of, you know, is really why we collapse grizzly bears down to the few percent that exist. And even under the Endangered Species Act, despite the efforts, particularly in the national parks, to get rid of garbage and institute rules, outside the parks, it's, you know, at best, it's 3 strikes and you're out in terms of conflict. But often it's a lot less than that. So it's a very sort of trigger-oriented approach in terms of state, you know, the state wildlife management and the culture of that. Yeah.
Louisa, I was asked the bill number of something you mentioned earlier. What was is the bill number?
Oh, Grijalva's bill. I don't know it off the top, but I have a link to it and some language about what it is and how you can support it and stuff. I'd be happy to, Sarah, send that to you, and you could get around it to maybe the people on the call.
Yeah, no problem. Let's see what we got here. Has the decreased human activity due to COVID been helpful? I think that's what it was. It says due to cover, but it was COVID.
I would say not so much, because Yellowstone Park, I mean, for June, for the early, you know, May and June, use was down, but I just read an article yesterday that, you know, we're back at, you know, maybe 70% of normal. So I don't think it, you know, we've gotten really much of a COVID bump, but I would say that in some very small grizzly bear populations, such as northern Spain, they have, you know, I was reading some stuff about that. So,
interesting.
But then in Spain, they took it seriously eventually.
And I'll just add that in the GYE, I think there have been 14, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, there have been, I think, 14 mortalities so far, and every one of those has been human caused. And in the Northern Continental Divide, I think it's been 22. There's a little bit of difference in numbers, but so mortalities are continuing. Some of it has to do with black bear hunting, and that's in the spring often is when there's those conflicts. What were you saying?
I mean, I was going to say that 22 for this time of year in Glacier is a lot of bear deaths. And the last 3 years, they've shattered records. Same with Yellowstone, you know, for the last 4 years down here too. We cannot continue to kill grizzly bears at the rate that we are. That is the biggest impediment to recovery, connectivity, the whole 9 yards, is we just can't kill what the number of bears we're killing.
Yeah, and the other thing to know is that the numbers that we might cite, like 52 in 2018 in the Northern Continental Divide, those are reported, and you can kind of assume that there are quite a number, maybe 1 to 1, that are not reported. So we're killing hundreds of bears every year.
Sarah, this might be a good question to end on. So Jim from Kansas says, you know, we don't have a lot of grizzlies here, but other than voting for reps that believe in the best available science, what can flatlanders do to help?
Well, yeah, I mean, right now what we have, I think we'll put up in our chat box, we have an action alert that will be, again, sending this letter to the Montana Grizzly Bear Advisory Council, asking them to please take into consideration a lot of the protective measures that are needed to help grizzly bears. So that's one thing you can do. Get engaged with organizations that do grizzly bear work and keep looking for new opportunities. There are always new opportunities, whether it's another forest plan. We just finished the Nez Perce Clearwater Forest Plan commenting, and that has a lot of potential impact on grizzly bears. And as somebody mentioned, the Custer Gallatin. So there are a lot of ongoing activities where we can speak up and try to have an impact on decisions that are made. Whether we actually do have an impact is questionable. Agencies often ignore grizzly bear advocates and what the science says is needed. So I don't know if either of you two have some more ideas of what people might be able to do.
Well, supporting Grijalva's bill would be good, but David and I every month now get a newsletter out where we summarize all the news that's happened and have, there's always something you can do. There is always somewhere you can help.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And funding, the bears and the people living with them need funding and support to do good proactive conflict prevention and wildlife crossings and all the things that entails. So, one of the things the council is discussing is a permanent dedicated grizzly bear fund that started in the federal realm that will also allow private donations. And so that's something to think about. If everybody in the land that cares about bears gave $5 to $10, we'd probably have enough to live off the interest and pay for bear conflict prevention into the future. So please pay attention if that comes up. We'd love to have your support that way as well.
And I should say that idea has been around for decades. It matters. It would really help, and the time has come.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you both. And we are over time, and I appreciate your extra time, everybody. And I really do want to thank you and Kelly, who's not here anymore, but our panelists and the people who are attending this webinar for being here, and especially for doing the work that you do. And again, there's the link in the chat box, and we want to make sure the Advisory Council knows that people support protective measures. And I also invite you to come back for our next installment of the Wild Earth webinars, where we talk about critical issues at a critical time. And thank you all for your participation today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.